There is a particular silence that falls in a great hall when a powerful man is deciding whether to unmake you. And I have stood inside it, with my sister's hand crushed in mine and our father across the floor, demanding that the crown be taken off the wrong daughter and put on the right one. He had the law on his side, or near enough. Everyone knew the king had called for the legitimate daughter of Harrowmore and gotten the bastard one instead. Everyone knew I was the mistake. The wrong Nell. The servant who had answered to a name that was only half mine. And now the Lord of Harrowmore stood in the king's hall, with his fine reasons and his fine outrage, demanding the error be corrected, the servant sent back to the kitchens, and his true daughter installed where she belonged. And my sister stood beside me shaking. Because she would rather have died than take the thing he wanted to give her, and I would rather have died than let him, and between the two of us we had exactly one crown, and one father determined to move it. I had answered a name that was not meant for me. I had known it was not meant for me, and I want you to understand, before I tell you the rest, that I did not do it to steal a crown. I did it to save my sister. Everything after that was just the world catching up. The Alpha King called a name at the selection, and it was my name, and it was not meant for me, and I knew it in the half-second before I answered. I answered anyway. My name was Nell, which is worth saying plainly, because for the first 19 years of my life it was a name no record in the realm had ever held. I was a bastard. My father was the Lord of Harrowmore, a powerful wolf of an old house, and my mother had been a servant in his hall, and I was the result, which in a house like Harrowmore means you are raised as furniture. I scrubbed the floors of my own father's home. I was never acknowledged, never entered in the house rolls, never called daughter. I was simply the servant girl who happened to have the Lord's chin, a resemblance everyone saw and no one mentioned. A nameless thing kept out of pity or habit or whatever it is that keeps a cruel man from putting his own blood out the gate. I had a name, Nell, given to me by my mother, for a grandmother I shared with the house's true children. But a bastard's name is written nowhere. It is only spoken, and only by people who do not matter. And so for 19 years my name existed only in the mouths of other servants, real to no one who could make it count. I had exactly one person in that house who treated me as though my name were worth writing, and her name was Nell too. That is the whole knot of this story, so hold it. My father's legitimate daughter, the true heir of Harrowmore, was named Eleanor, for the same grandmother I was named for, and her family called her Nell, the way you shorten a grand name into a loved one. 2 Nells in one house, one written in gold in the house rolls and one written nowhere at all, and by every law and custom we should have been strangers, the lady and the servant who happened to share a grandmother's name. We were not strangers. Eleanor had been the one soft thing in that hard house since we were small. She had slipped me food and taught me my letters in secret, and once, when we were girls, given me our grandmother's plain wooden comb, the only thing in the world that named me as kin to anyone, and told me that whatever the rolls said, I was her sister, and she did not care who knew it. I loved her more than I have ever loved anything. Remember that. It is the reason I answered a name that was not mine, because the selection came for Eleanor, and Eleanor was terrified. The Alpha King was to choose a Luna, and the whole realm knew, in the way the realm always knows these things, that the choice was arranged. My father had spent a fortune and a year of manoeuvring to have his legitimate daughter placed before the king, as the intended, the safe political match. The alliance that would make Harrowmore one of the great powers of the Iron Reach. Eleanor was to be called, and Eleanor was to answer, and Eleanor was to be Luna, and my father was to rule through her the way cruel men always plan to rule through the daughters they treat as coin. Eleanor did not want it. She wanted it so little that she had grown thin and grey with dread over the season. Because she loved someone else, a low huntsman of no rank, quietly, hopelessly. And because she knew, better than anyone, that to be made lunar by our father's design was to spend the rest of her life as his instrument, a soft woman broken slowly into a hard man's tool. She had confided all of it to me in the dark, the way she confided everything, and I had held her while she wept and been able to do nothing, because what can a bastard servant do against a lord's arranged crown? On the day of the selection, I was there only as her attendant, a servant permitted to stand at the wall and hold her lady's things, and I watched my sister stand in that great hall the colour of ash, and I watched the Alpha King rise to call the name my father had bought, and I saw Eleanor sway on her feet, and I understood that she was not going to be able to do it. She was going to faint, or refuse, or break, in front of the whole realm, and my father would never forgive her. And whatever punishment a lord like Harrowmore devises for a daughter who humiliates him in front of a king, she would suffer it for the rest of her life. And then the king called the name. Nell of Harrowmore, he said. He had been coached, you see, to use the warm familiar form, the loved name, to seem gracious, to call the intended not by her grand Eleanor, but by the Nell her family used, so the realm would see a king already tender toward his chosen. He meant my sister. Everyone in that hall knew he meant my sister. The name was hers, the pet name of the legitimate daughter of Harrowmore. But it was also, fully and only, and for the first time in my life spoken aloud where it could count. Mine, Nell of Harrowmore. My father's house and my grandmother's name, the two things I had been denied my whole life, said together by a king in front of the realm. And my sister swaying, breaking, unable to answer. And I did the thing that a lifetime of loving her had built into me before my mind could vote. I stepped forward from the wall, and I said, "I am here." The hall did not understand what had happened, and for a moment neither did the king. And neither, I think, did I. A servant had stepped out of the attendance and answered the king's call. It made no sense. And then the sense of it arrived on every face at once, in a slow, horrified wave, that there were two Nells of Harrowmore, the lady and the bastard, and that the wrong one had answered, and that the Alpha King of the Iron Reach had called for his highborn intended, and gotten a scrub maid who happened to share her name. My father went the colour of ash himself. Eleanor's head came up, understanding flooding into her grey face, and I saw her open her mouth to correct it. To save me. To say no. That is not the one you meant. That is only my sister. And I caught her eye across the hall, and I willed her, with everything I had, to stay silent, because I had just done the only thing I would ever be able to do for her, and I was not going to let her undo it. I had answered. I was the mistake. And a mistake could be sent quietly back to the kitchens, humiliated but free, while my sister, spared, unchosen, overlooked at last, might slip out of the trap our father had built and go to her huntsman and be no one's instrument ever again. I had not stolen a crown. I had thrown my own body over the one aimed at my sister, the way you throw yourself over any falling thing you love. I waited for the king to correct it. It was the obvious thing, the only thing. He had called for a lady and gotten a servant. He had merely to say so, and I would be removed, and the real Nell would be summoned, and the arranged world would right itself. The whole hall waited for it. My father was already drawing breath to demand it. The Alpha King looked at me for a long moment. And then he did the thing that changed both our lives, the thing no one in that hall expected, which was that he did not correct it. Nell of Harrowmore, he said again, slowly, looking directly at me. The bastard, the servant, the wrong one. So you are. And he did not send me back to the wall. I did not understand why for a long time, and the not understanding nearly drove me mad, because it made no sense that the Alpha King would keep the mistake. His name was Brogan, And he was, I would learn, a reluctant king in a way the realm never saw. A man who had been manoeuvred toward this arranged match for a year and dreaded it as much as my sister did. Because he did not want a Luna bought and placed by Lord Harrowmore any more than Eleanor wanted to be one. He had gone to that selection a cornered man, resigned to calling a name that would chain him to a scheming lord's daughter for the sake of an alliance he could not politically refuse. And then the wrong woman had answered, and it had given him, in a single unplanned instant, the one thing a king in an arranged trap never gets: an out, a mistake. A servant who stepped forward, whom no one had arranged, whom Lord Harrowmore could not control, married to no faction, owed to no counsel. The selection had appeared to choose for him, and a king can defy his counsel far more easily by pointing to the right than by simply saying no. That was the reason the court gave, and the reason my father raged against. And the reason I first believed that the king had cleverly seized an accident to escape a match he hated. And it was true, as far as it went. But it was not the whole truth, and the whole truth was a thing Brogan himself could not say for a long while, because he was reluctant about it, in the deepest way, the way a man is reluctant to admit that the convenient accident was also the thing he wanted. Because his wolf had chosen. The instant I stepped forward and said I am here, in a servant's plain dress, with my father's chin and my grandmother's nameless name, something in the Alpha King had gone still. And certain in a way no arranged lady had ever made it go. And he had kept the mistake not only because it freed him, but because his wolf would not let him send me back to the wall. He did not understand it himself at first. He only knew that when the moment came to correct the error, he could not make himself do it, and he dressed that inability up in the language of politics, because the truth, that a king's wolf had chosen a bastard scrub-maid over a high-born arranged bride the instant she opened her mouth, was not a thing a reluctant, cornered, careful man was ready to say out loud. If you have ever thrown yourself in front of a thing to save someone you love and found, to your total bewilderment, that the thing did not crush you, but crowned you, then you know the vertigo I carried out of that hall, and you know it is not a thing you can set down. I am going to tell you what my father did when his bought crown landed on the daughter he had never named, and how a sister I had died to protect became the one who saved me back, and what it costs a nameless woman to finally claim a name in front of the realm. Stay with me to the great hall and the father's demand. The wrong name, called by mistake, turned out to be the truest thing anyone ever said about me, but my father spent a season trying to prove it a lie, and he very nearly buried me to do it. My father could not abide it, and I want to be honest that his rage was not only greed, though it was mostly greed. It was the specific fury of a man watching the daughter he had thrown away take the thing he had bought for the daughter he had groomed. He had spent a year and a fortune making Eleanor a queen he could rule through. Instead, the crown had fallen on me, a bastard who owed him nothing, who knew every cruelty of his house from the inside, who had scrubbed his floors and been called nothing, and who would sooner see Harrowmore burn than lift a finger to give him power. A controllable daughter had become an uncontrollable one. He had not lost the crown. He had lost the crown to an enemy who shared his blood, and he moved against me with everything he had. He moved first with the law, which is where powerful men always begin. He petitioned the King's Council to void the selection as an error, a case of mistaken identity, a servant who had fraudulently answered a call meant for her betters, a selection corrupted, and therefore invalid. It was clever, because it was half true. I had answered a name not meant for me. I had known it. By the letter of the thing, I was exactly the fraud he named me. And for a stretch of days the council leaned toward him, because a bastard scrub-maid on the throne was a thing half of them wanted undone as badly as my father did. And the law gave them the excuse. And when the law began to fail him, when it became clear the king would not void the selection, would not send me back, would defy the whole council to keep the mistake, my father took the other road. The one cruel men keep ready. If the bastard could not be removed by law, she could be removed. A servant elevated by a fluke, dead of some sad accident before her claiming was sealed, and the selection would have to be held again, and this time his true daughter would answer, and his year's work would be saved. He had disposed of inconvenient servants before. I knew that about my father better than anyone, because I had grown up watching which of us disappeared. He simply had never had to dispose of one who was about to be lunar, and he found, to his fury, that it was harder to reach a woman the king would not let out of his sight, but Lord Vaughan of Harrowmore was nothing if not patient. And he found his opening the way he found everything, through the people I loved. He took Eleanor. He took my sister back to Harrowmore under the guise of a father's right, and he sent me word, in his own cold hand, of the terms. I would step aside. I would confess the fraud, void the selection, and go quietly, and Eleanor would answer the next call as she was always meant to. Or my sister, back inside the walls of the house that had always been able to break her, would suffer for my ambition in ways he described just clearly enough. He had done the arithmetic of a man who understood exactly what I had answered that name for. I had thrown myself in front of the crown to save Eleanor. He would simply put Eleanor back in the crown's path and dare me to stand aside a second time. This is where the woman who had spent 19 years being nobody had to decide whether being somebody meant anything at all, and I will tell you that for a night I nearly did what he asked. Because I had never wanted the crown, I had only ever wanted my sister safe, and he had made those two things enemies, and I was so used to sacrificing myself for her that stepping aside felt like the truest version of who I was. But I had learnt something in a season of being Nell of Harrowmore spoken aloud, and it was this, that stepping aside had never once saved anyone. It had kept me nameless for 19 years, and it had kept Eleanor trapped, for all of hers, because our whole lives we had each been trying to disappear to protect the other. And all our disappearing had ever done was hand our father more room to do as he liked. I had answered that name to spare my sister, and it had been a brave thing and a loving thing. But it had also been the old thing, the small thing, the throwing of my body over the falling crown, instead of asking whether the crown had to fall at all. The way to save Eleanor was not to sacrifice myself a second time. It was to stop sacrificing, and use the one thing I had never had before, a name the realm now knew. A king who would not let me go. A voice loud enough, at last, to be heard, and turn it on the man who had spent both our lives making us small. So I did not step aside. I went to the king, and for the first time in my life I did not ask to disappear. I asked for help. That is the great hall the cold open promised you. My father came to demand his correction, the bastard removed, the true daughter restored, and he brought Eleanor with him, pale and shaking, as both his proof and his hostage, and he laid out his fine reasons before the king and the council. Certain that the law and the shame of my birth would do his work for him, and this time we did not let him. Eleanor and I stood together, the two Nells of Harrowmore, the lady and the bastard, and we did the thing our father had spent our whole lives making sure we would never do, which was to stop protecting him with our silence. I named what I was. A bastard, yes. A servant, yes. A woman who had answered a name not meant for her, and I named why, in front of the whole realm, that I had stepped forward to spare my sister a match she dreaded, thrown to a king by a father who trafficked in his own daughters. And Eleanor, my gentle, terrified sister, found a courage I had never seen in her, and named the rest, our father's cruelties, the servants who had vanished, the crown he had bought to make an instrument of her, and the truth that she would sooner die than be his queen, and that the bastard he despised was worth 10 of the daughter he had groomed. 2 daughters, one legitimate and one not, turning on the father who had weaponized the gap between them. In front of a king who was listening, Lord Vaughan did what cornered men do when the law turns in their hands and the daughters they counted on to stay silent will not. He had brought men, because a Lord of Harrowmore does not go anywhere without them, and when he saw his standing collapse, he reached for the older solution, moving to take Eleanor out of that hall by force, and the bastard along with her, to finish at Harrowmore what he could not finish at court. His man came for my sister, and I did the thing I have always done, the thing a lifetime of loving her built into me. I put myself between them, but this time I was not alone, and I was not nameless, and the king's second Dane was already moving, and the king himself was on his feet, and the blade that came for us opened my arm instead of taking my sister. A bright cold line and a wash of heat, my blood coming down onto the floor of a hall I would once have been made to scrub. Then Dane had my father's man down, and the guard had Lord Vaughan, and it was over, the 2 Nells of Harrowmore standing bloodied and unbroken, and the lord who had named neither of us finally answering for both. It shook the realm, and the shaking was overdue. A lord who traffics his daughters for power is a common enough evil that the great houses had learnt to look away from it. A lord exposed doing it by the 2 daughters themselves, the crowned bastard and the freed heir, standing together, was the kind of thing that made every house with a bartered daughter suddenly nervous. Lord Vaughan of Harrowmore was given to the law. His cruelties entered at last into the very rolls that had never held my name, and Harrowmore passed, by the king's judgment, not to a son or a scheme, but to Eleanor, who rules it now gently and well, and who married her huntsman, and who has never once been anyone's instrument again. The realm learned that the accident everyone had clucked over, the wrong name, the bastard who answered, had exposed a rot the law had been protecting, and that the mistake had been truer than the design. It made the powerful afraid of their own bought crowns. It should have. My arm healed slow, and left a long scar, and I find I do not mind it. It is the second best thing I ever earned. The best was a name. My name, Nell of Harrowmore, written at last where it had never been, in the rolls of a house that had denied me, and the rolls of a throne that had chosen me. Spoken aloud by a king in front of the realm, until it could never again be a thing that existed only in the mouths of people who did not count. It is a year now as I set this down, and I am Luna of the Iron Reach, which the heralds have finally stopped stumbling over, and which I confess I still cannot quite believe began with me answering to half of my own name. Brogan is still a reluctant man in his way. You do not unlearn a cornered life quickly, but he is not reluctant about me, and the difference is the whole of my happiness. He kept our grandmother's plain wooden comb, the one Eleanor gave me when we were girls, the only thing that ever named me kin to anyone before a king did. It sits on a shelf, among the treasures of the Iron Reach, worth nothing, and more than all of them, and when the court forgets that their Luna was a scrub maid, he likes to remind them. Because he has decided, my nameless years are not a shame to be hidden, but the truest thing about how I came to him. Eleanor visits often, my sister, the other Nell, and we are the 2 daughters of Harrowmore still. Except that now, both our names are written, and neither of us has to disappear to protect the other, which is a freedom I did not know to want until I had it. He came to find me just now, where I was writing this by the fire, and read over my shoulder the way he is not supposed to, and always does, and asked what I was setting down. I told him I was writing the story of the day he called the wrong name at the selection. He was quiet a moment, in the way that used to read as a cornered king's caution, and that I now know is a reluctant man choosing a true word over an easy one. You keep calling it the wrong name, he said. The mistake, the accident, the servant who answered a call meant for her betters. I have let it stand for a year, because it is the humble story, and you are humble past sense. but I will say it where you cannot unwrite it." He touched the scar on my arm the way he does. "I did not call the wrong name, Nell. I called the name of the woman I was arranged to marry and dreaded. And a woman I had never met stepped out of the servants and answered it, and my wolf knew her before she finished speaking. And I understood in that single instant that the arrangement had been the mistake, and the accident was the truth. Everyone in that hall thought the wrong Nell answered. But there is no wrong Nell of Harrowmore. There is the one your father bought and dreaded, and the one your grandmother named and your sister loved, and my wolf chose. And the right, fumbling, drunk on coincidence, happened to call the second one. So do not write that I called the wrong name. Write that I called a name by accident, and the right woman answered, the only true thing that whole bought, arranged, corrupted selection ever produced." He almost smiled. The name was never the mistake. The only mistake was how long it took all of us to admit which Nell it truly belonged to. So I will leave you with the question I still turn over, and I would truly love to know what you think. Brogan swears there was no wrong Nell, that the accident called the right woman, that his wolf knew me the instant I spoke. But I only spoke at all because my sister was breaking, and I threw myself in front of the crown to spare her. I did not answer for love, or fate, or myself. I answered for Eleanor. So was it truly fate that put me on that throne, the king's wolf choosing the right woman through a fumbled right? Or was it only a bastard's oldest habit, sacrificing herself for the sister she loved, that happened, for once, to be rewarded instead of punished? Did the right choose me? Or did I simply, one last time, step in front of a falling thing and get lucky in where it landed? Tell me your verdict below. I read every one. And so, he has confessed, does the king. And if you want to stay in the iron reach with us a while longer, comment my name, and I will tell you next what happened when the realm's other nameless ones, the bastards and the servants and the daughters written nowhere, began arriving at our gates. Having heard there was a Luna who had gotten her name written by answering to half of it. So if you have spent your life with a name no record holds, wherever you are listening from tonight, say it out loud anyway, and answer to it when it is called, even if you are not sure it was meant for you. You never know when the wrong name, in the right mouth, turns out to have been yours all along. I answered to half my name to save my sister, and a king wrote the whole of it into the rolls of the realm. It was the truest thing anyone ever called me.